Hi, Jeremy.
Once again, Marcia,
Back
it's great to
again.
see you. Yes.
All right, today is session 8 of AP2, sharing narratives across. It's a big question. Jeremy, why do you actually believe that this notion of listening across empathy walls is so important for today's time?
Well, I think because a lot of the fractiousness and the divisiveness in the world that we're seeing, the conflict, is a result of people, societies, leaders feeling that there's a standoff between what they want and what somebody else wants, as if these were incompatible. And at the core of a lot of these conflicts is a dispute over representation, inclusion, voice, um, and not wanting to hear other people's stories because you experience the world as a hostile, competitive one, and if I have to listen to somebody else's story, it means I don't get to talk about my own, or that it comes at the expense of my own story. Um, and I think this is often what happens when the world enters a mood of competition and a feeling of scarce resources, and as it gets nasty and competitive. And one of the expressions of that competition is the creation of what are called empathy walls, walls that people build against that isolate them from their ability to listen to and empathize with the stories of other people on the other side of the wall or the other side of the border. So just as barbed wire fences are going up all over the place, walls are going up. President Trump wants to build a wall that separates Mexico from the United States. All this talk of walls and fences and barbed wire, in a way, the echo of that, what's really happening is something inside the head, right? That has to do with resistance against walling off the stories of other people. And so that's why we're calling them empathy walls. Um, and so the difficulty, the challenge for us is how to create narratives or pathways across those walls or through those fences. And part of it is about the ability to tell story, which is what we're doing in this experiment. Part of it has to do with the skills that I'm afraid sometimes are in diminished supply, the skills of listening to stories. And part of the key of the ability to listen to stories is also our understanding of what a story is. So when we are manufacturing our narratives and our stories of each other, part of what we're doing is developing some skills in listening to other people's stories. So, and there's an interaction then between the two. If we can understand what we're doing, I think that's part of the challenge of bringing down the empathy walls that are the reason why people are wanting to put up the physical walls.
Absolutely. I mean, you're painting a pretty bleak picture of our world, one with lots of borders, not only physical, neatly into versus the other, the ones that belong into borders of the people that do not belong into the borders of this nation, the people that belong to our ethnic group, the people that do not belong to our ethnic group. So lots of borders and the accompanying stories that kind of appeared to sort the world in a neat place, in a neat way, but in an ultimately very exclusionary way. And you're saying that one of the ways of consciously breaking down first the mental and then actually also the physical borders is by listening, by empathizing with the people that we might initially find it hard to empathize with, right? But making the effort to go and to listen and to try and empathize in order to arrive at a different story about them.
That's right. And empathy is not the same as agreement. I mean, I think empathy is the ability to understand where the story is coming from, to reconstruct the reason for the existence of the story and why someone might feel some way about something that happened in the past. We may not agree with it. And in fact, we can even say so. And one of the powers of this ability to story tell and story listen is to say, uh, uh, look, I understand where your story is coming from. I don't agree with it, but I understand where it's coming from. That recognition of another person's story is a very powerful instrument. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, so what we do when we learn storytelling skills is also simultaneously recognizing the properties of other people's stories.
And here I think there's a very important difference to what we've learned earlier in the course about empathy in the context of oral history, because we have used this term empathy in the context of oral history in a kind of unidirectional way, in the sense that the interviewer is learning to empathize with the interviewee, but that didn't include that the interviewer could say, I agree or I disagree, because the interviewer was explicitly supposed to not make the interview about themselves, right? So like there is a different way of one way of empathizing in order to listen to a story. But then, as you said, when you step back from the actual interview setting, then a historian or any person can actually then say, okay, I've listened to this, I've heard it, I understand where it's coming from, but this is my opinion. And that is a crucial difference right there.
Absolutely. I mean, so these, the challenge here then is to think about even in the everyday practices of the research that we are all doing together when we think about conversations with other people is itself a practice that goes inside the creation of the narrative. So that the empathy wall is not just about creating the story that's going to get broadcast to the wider world, but it's also inside the exchanges that we have as historians with our sources and our sources with us.
Absolutely. And I remember that Joan Didion said, we tell our stories to survive or to live.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a very interesting and powerful idea about stories, right? So we all need stories in order to even conceptualize the world, to work through what it means to be alive. But we have to be mindful about where we take our stories from, and that we don't inadvertently construct walls for ourselves by not making an effort to go and listen to other stories that might not be, there's a lot of talk about bubbles these days that might not be in our social or the bubble where we are at. It takes effort to listen to other stories, but I think as we've learned in the readings also, and we've heard in this discussion, that it's definitely worth it to try and break down empathy walls.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Do you have any final takeaway for our students on this?
I mean, the final is when we think about words and images that go into the stories, I mean, just to remind ourselves of the obvious, which goes to the point you were just taking from Joan Didion, is that words and images matter. I mean, they have power. They can connect and they can disconnect, and we just have to understand that much more. And I'd say more and more, research is being done on this, the power of storytelling and narratives, and the need to sometimes change the narratives or challenge the narratives or explain that there are more narratives available to us, including, and then we can end on this note, because I don't want it to sound like this is so bleak, right? That it's just about managing conflict. It's also about creating connection. That if we can understand that changing the narrative and empowering people to have capacities to listen and to storytell, they go together, means that this is a kind of agency, right? It's a secret kind of agency that historians can have in the world, including all of us who are in this experimental space together.
Absolutely. So on that note of agency,
Yeah.
we will end. This is a great ending. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Stay in touch. Bye.
Bye.